welcome to another in our Oscars edition of our Conversations with Sound Artists podcast. I'm Glenn Kaiser, I'm the director of the Dolby Institute, and today we're focusing our conversation on Blade Runner 2049, which, like all the films in both categories this year, is nominated for both the sound editing and the sound mixing Academy Awards. And I am really thrilled that we have all of the nominees for Blade Runner 2049, at least around the table or virtually with us. So we have, in the sound editing category, Mark Mangini and Theo Green.
Hi.
And in the sound mixing category, Ron Bartlett, Doug Hemphill.
Good morning.
And Skyping in from Budapest, Mac Ruth.
Hi.
Welcome back.
So I just wanted to start off by asking you guys, the original Blade Runner, 1982, directed by Ridley Scott, is such an iconic film. And I think, when people, and it's obviously it's earned its spot as a classic, science fiction film and has influenced a generation of filmmakers. But I think when most people think about the original film and think of it in terms of its sort of groundbreaking, iconic status, they think about it visually, they think about production design, they think about the cinematography. But for me, it was equally groundbreaking in terms of its sound design and its score and the way the track came together, and specifically kind of the blending of sound design and music. So I just wanted to kind of put the question to the group, like, how do you approach revisiting such an iconic film? Was there sort of a pressure to kind of emulate the original work, or how do you pay homage to it but do your own thing?
Well, I will say before Mark speaks that some of the fans we've heard from about the Blade Runner 2049, they share the same feelings that they had with the first film. So I feel like we've done something very successful in that it's a mood and a feeling and a tone that's been creative that has carried the original track forward, and I think done some new wonderful things, actually.
Yeah. Denis, certainly one of Denis' mandates for Theo and I was to honor the first film without copying it. So Theo and I spent a good deal of time deconstructing the first film to kind of try to figure out what made it tick. And among other things, we discovered that the film, in many scenes, is replete with these kind of designed musical atmospheres, many of which, it turns out, Vangelis had actually composed, but you think of them more as the sound design of the scene. And so we realized that one of our first challenges was to emulate that, to use that as a model for the sounds that we would create for the film, embedding every scene in these kind of atmospheric musical textures, so that it felt like the first film. And so that was, and Theo, you can pick up on that. That was sort of one of our first sound design challenges.
And of course, one of the things that made it easier, it was not such a straight sequel to the first film, but something, in a sense, it's a standalone film that takes place in the same universe, partly because it takes place 30 years on from the original. So that gave us quite a leeway to, obviously things look different. The spinner car has evolved 30 years on, the blaster gun, and certain other iconic things that we think of as producing iconic sounds from the first film. We got the license to evolve and transform those sounds and make them our own. But the difficult thing, I guess, was just making it feel as if it belonged in that same universe and that it truly had evolved from the Blade Runner universe that we know and love.
The fortunate thing for Doug and I is we were able to work on the final cut version for Ridley. So we did a restoration on the original. That was about, 6-8 years ago?
It was 8 years ago.
Yeah, I was going to ask you guys about that because so Ridley Scott went back and did theoretically the final cut of the original Blade Runner.
Continued, maybe?
Yeah. So Ron and Doug, you guys had worked with him on that. So what was that process like? Kind of just what shape were the original elements in? What did you guys do in 2007?
That begs the question, which I bet a lot of people out there are wondering: what's it like to go to work each day with Ridley Scott and work on Blade Runner? We got to hear stories of his, when he was working on it, that were just absolutely amazing, what he went through to create that film. Yeah. And it was a real struggle.
We were literally sitting on the Warner Brothers lot, and he's like, we shot it right over there. And he's telling all these stories. It was so, visceral, because we were sitting right there, and he's telling us about how, when they were shooting that last scene, with the Rutger Hauer and the tears in the rain.
Oh,
it's
so good.
literally like 100 yards from us.
And he's a man of enormous confidence, obviously. So for Ridley, it was like, I need to get rid of this narration. I want it out.
Yeah.
So that was one of our main tasks. And also to say, I know Ron feels the same way. Ron has done several restorations on Kubrick films and whatnot. When we approach a restoration of a soundtrack like the original Blade Runner, we want to keep the authenticity and tone that film originally had. Even if some of the track is a little naive or whatever, that's part of the ethos of that movie. So we want to keep that intact. That's how we approached it.
Was that a 5.1 mix, or was it just a two track?
It was.
I think it was a 424.
Yeah.
The original.
Yeah,
So
it
I don't
was-
think you had stems.
And we were dealing with three mixes.
LCRF.
To my knowledge, the three mixes that we had were the British mix done in London, what was called a New Art mix, and then a Skywalker mix. So we were taking those three mixes and creating the non-narration mix for Ridley.
Most of that was from Printmasters. It was not elements where you get to, oh, great, we'll just turn off the narration. No.
You did not have access to even really stems or
Very little.
units?
Yeah. There's a couple of things we had, a few stems, but most of it was Printmasters from different mixes.
So how did you, having gone through that experience of working with Ridley in 2007 on the original restoration, how did that change your perspective going into Blade Runner 2049?
Well, but we were fans of Blade Runner before working. So for us, it was win-win. We're fans to start with. Then we get to work on this film to boot. Right. And then bizarrely, out of the blue, Denis calls us to work on Blade Runner 2049. So it's actually a very strange chronology.
And you guys none of you guys had worked with Denis Villeneuve before, is that?
No, just been a fan.
So how did this team come together?
Well, it starts with Theo, which is an important story. I think this is a really important sort of point to make in the sort of evolution of sound for film.
Denis did something very unusual. I'd met Denis first at a screening of Arrival, a test screening of Arrival, as I've worked with his editor Joe Walker a few times before. And I normally restrain myself and don't go completely gushing to a director after something. But
Did you fanboy out?
I did. I completely. I really embarrassed myself. And I told him I think this is the style of sci-fi I've been waiting for all my life. It feels gritty and real, but it's telling a story that's effectively something that Hollywood has approached before, but it's always it goes in a different way. It's a different style when Hollywood approaches a movie like that. He'd sort of brought his Canadian indie sensibilities.
French Canadian.
Yeah, French Canadian. Sorry. Yeah, exactly. It's Québécois sensibilities.
But he definitely thinks of himself as an independent filmmaker.
Yeah,
he
absolutely.
definitely does.
And so I'd met him there, and when Joe Walker started working on Blade Runner, again something interesting happened there in that Joe Walker was brought on and was set up with an editing room in Budapest as they started the shoot. In fact, before they started the shoot, he was consulting, looking at the storyboards with them, and trying to decide what things might be a problem later. And it was Denis and Joe who had the prescience to think, what if we bring a sound designer on, during production rather than it being a post-production thing? When you've got a universe that has so much world building involved, something where it's an alternate universe or something where, obviously
Things don't exist.
things that don't exist are taking place on an everyday basis, like flying cars or
Baseline machines.
baseline machines. And I mean,
I got a lot of questions about the baseline testing procedure, by the way, but that's another subject.
It's
we'll
a
come
House
back to.
Institute exercise.
But yeah, that became like I guess a way, instead of Joe always working with off-the-shelf effects or putting in the sound of a vacuum cleaner or something to make up for the sound of a spinning car. The idea was, why don't we start developing the sound at the same time as they're first looking at the images, which I believe Denis said is something that had been like a long-term dream of his to, he'd been hoping to do that on his very first shorts and first features, but there was never the budget there to cover bringing people who are traditionally thought of as post-production on during production.
Right, because there's a perception that, like, I think a lot of uninformed producers would think, well, that's just going to cost me a lot more money because I'm carrying those people for that much longer. But
there it is.
But I know from conversations with you, it actually was a fairly small, tight crew that worked on this film. So to me, the argument is like you're redistributing the money, but spending it much more smartly.
Well, I think you save money, because when you get down to that choke point at the end, and when you're at the end of a movie, it is a choke point.
Yeah.
That's it. Everything piles up right there. The work that, let's say, Theo has done ahead of time is going to save you money at that choke point.
That's exactly what you're saying. Yeah.
I think it's also that thing of, it's just an artificial separation for a director to be getting intimate with the images that he's captured on set and editing them for months and months, and then suddenly at the end of the process along come a sound team and contribute something which ultimately can change things so much that the editor can start wishing that he'd cut it differently. And I mean, it's being able to feed in a part of the process that much earlier so that they can start making decisions. And there were certain scenes where, we'll talk about them later maybe, but there were certain scenes where, I think the scenes would have been cut if it wasn't for an idea that came either from Joe Walker's editing early on or from the sound design. So that was the idea, was to get someone working alongside Joe and Denis right from the get-go.
So you were actually in Budapest?
Yeah, I went out to Budapest in, I think it was late August or mid-August in 2016. Met Mac, Ruth.
Well, that's
actually busy recording.
That's actually a nice segue into including Mac in the conversation. So Mac, it's actually pretty rare that we're able to have conversations with the post-production team and the production sound mixer. So for those listening in who, our audience is pretty tech savvy, but we also have some film fans. So Mac, tell us a little bit about your job. So you're on the set recording with, while the cameras are rolling with the actors. So tell us a little bit about how that process worked on Blade Runner. And you guys shot mostly in Budapest and Europe, right?
That's right. Yeah. It worked out as a really traditional style of shooting. Roger Deakins and Denis together, they were just a fantastic team. And Donald Sparks, first AD, the way they ran it, it was, in-camera effects, lots of practical special effects. All the lighting effects were practical. It was basically a one-camera movie with infinite attention to detail on that shot, which allowed us to do almost sometimes unique thing, and that is we really got a chance to focus on traditional camera perspective sound using the booms. And I think it really shows up at some level. It's a very psychoacoustic reality, a very psychoacoustic thing that you feel that's different if it's not there. And I think to be part of that team on set, to work with very traditional methods. We had obviously all of the, the rather new school communication systems, which allowed things to happen like the baseline test and the glass, the hermetically sealed sets and communication systems, so we can motivate performance on set. There's a lot of that, and that's part of the creative process on set. But the recording itself was very traditional, and we're very proud of it and the opportunity to be there with those kind of traditional, filmmakers with such foresight. It's been actually fantastic. It's fantastic, I think.
Were there any that stand out in your memory, any particular scenes that posed really difficult challenges for you to record on this particular film?
Wow. You could point to the practical things like the effects, the stuff in the rain. Some of those things are always, they create their own signal to noise ratio issues, don't they? But it was all in all, you're given the best chance when an actor, when a director and a team really knows the performance they're looking for, and they know where to place their resources. And we were basically, there to allow the actors to facilitate themselves through the scene and to capture performance. I don't even call it sound anymore, audio on set. I say we're losing actor performance. or I call it actor performance, and that's what we're there for. And there's, your normal workflow stuff like reliability and how you do it and methodology. But I think we're there, and to be allowed the opportunity to do such a good job is a real privilege.
That's great. Well, I think it's probably very clever that you figured out to do that, because if you're the sound guy and you say, hey, I'm not getting good sound, that probably rings much lower alarm bells than if you say, I'm losing actor performance.
We love you, Mac. That's beautiful.
We do love you.
And so
I've trademarked that.
very good.
I like it.
So then, Mark, how did you get involved in the film?
I got a call while I was in London from Alcon asking if I wanted to meet with Denis. And that came about because Theo and Joe and Denis, I didn't know, you guys had just screened Mad Max, or just had seen it. And I guess you felt that the style, that approach was the right approach for Blade Runner. And they thought, well, let's have Mark in. And so I flew to Budapest for 3 hours. And I had to do a pitch in front of the entire crew. Roger Deakins and 200 members stopped what they were doing on a soundstage to listen to Mark do his used car salesman version of "This is why sound is important to a movie."
You must have been pretty impressive.
I cringed when I walked away from it. But I then had the good fortune to go back to the editing room and sit with Joe Walker and watch some scenes and talk about the movie and my approach. And I think that's where I really found a sort of a kindred spirit there. And I think we saw eye to eye about what he and Denis wanted.
Well, I think it bears pointing out that Joe used to cut sound. So
He's an extraordinarily gifted sound editor and composer.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Well,
He plays I don't think anyone knows, he plays that little Chopin motif.
Brahms.
A Brahms motif in the desert that lures Kay into the casino.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, I wanted to talk with you about that because, obviously Joe has a composition and sound editing background. Theo, you're known also as a composer. Yeah. So there's a lot. I'm really interested in this cross-pollination of music and sound design in this specific film, which I think very appropriately echoes back to what you were talking about with the Vangelis track on the original. So how, wearing all those different hats, and how did you guys decide, like, and especially in working with Hans Zimmer and Ben Wallfish, like, how did you guys decide what elements are coming from which department and keeping everything moving forward? Because Hans and Ben didn't come in until late in the process.
Right. I think to answer that last question first, Denis really orchestrated that. He really encouraged Theo and I to do this sound composition work. That was an early exhortation to us. But I think he had it in his head because we didn't really interact with Hans or Ben. They came on late in the piece. But Theo and I were set free very early on to begin the compositional work in a very free-form way to create these musical textures.
Well, I would add too, Mark, it's important for people out there to realize that I think for Denis, it wasn't music and sound.
No.
It's just sound in the movie that tells the story. That's all.
That's all he ever saw it as, and I think that's one of our really groundbreaking achievements in this film is that we strove to have it feel as though this is just the sound of Blade Runner. It's like one soundtrack. Normally you think of the soundtrack as the music to a movie, but we are a sort of unified soundtrack. All we contributed was that's what you should hear at this moment in the film. And it was always that sort of narrative-driven idea that inspired Theo and I and these guys to sort of how we crafted and found our way through the movie.
So because the sound design is so musical, and because Ben and Hans came in so late, what were the conversations with them around, like, was there sort of did they have specific moments that they were focusing on, or how did they kind of fit in with what you guys had been doing?
Part of this comes from the way that Joe and Denis see it as if you're going through an editing process and you're either temping in music or you've got a composer kind of composing for each scene, it sort of functions almost as a crutch for that scene. Perhaps you're not focusing on the mechanics of the scene and the plot as closely as you should. It's sort of it's a balm that makes everything feel better. And in many ways, I think their idea was to have sound provide what score normally does in terms of sort of guiding us, giving us hints, helping thematically connect different parts of the film. And then, as Joe brilliantly puts it, sort of use the composer's score to bring in the cavalry for those moments where it's really, really needed. And that's something that can come in later in the process. Right. So I think we had, to some extent, already defined the areas where the score would be needed, and we'd sort of backed off on the sound on those moments, knowing that something big was going to be coming in there.
And that's a function of Denis' prescience of starting Theo as early as he did, and then bringing me on as early. I came on far earlier than a traditional supervising sound editor would come on. And those early months for me were pure design time to create with Theo all these fantastic textures that we made that would have been thought of, or maybe are thought of as music. And I think one of the highest compliments I've received in the various lectures and discussions we've had about the film is that audience members have come up and said, I couldn't tell where the boundaries were. I think that's the highest compliment we could have been paid.
I agree. Can you guys tell the story as an example of how Denis works with music of Kay's Walk in the Las Vegas desert, how that started out?
Ron sat in that hot seat. That's your story, my friend.
It's a great story.
Early on, Hans and Ben were told to deliver wide stems, so everything was separate. There wasn't a traditional, like, here's all the synth stuff, here's the orchestral stuff, here's the strings, whatever. Sure. It was all the synth tracks. So I would get a whole bunch of, like, left, right, stereo tracks to pick from. And it's not like we arbitrarily went, oh, I like that, let's put it in. Obviously, we looked at the entire piece, saw its intent, and then we would play all the tracks for Denis and say, how's this playing? What do you like? And we would pick through ones that, he was not a fan of the more modern sounds, some of the newer synth sounds. So he would typically he'd say, that's such a great sound, but not in my movie. Because he really loved it, but he would just take it out.
And inversely, I'm not going to interrupt your story, but a lot of what Ben was doing was also something you could have considered as sound design. It wasn't necessarily musical.
Absolutely.
So we always had this crossover.
Yeah.
Continue with your story.
Yeah, there were sounds like we called it the motorcycle sound. Or
the seagull.
Or the seagull.
You're talking like, so I watched the film again, and like and some of the Los Angeles city soundscapes, there's this what sounds like a really loud engine revving. Is that what you're talking about?
The score.
That's
the score.
Yeah.
I thought that was you guys.
Exactly. That's the whole thing. You never knew what was what.
He's getting credit for things we did too. Yeah. So let's be clear.
There were times I'd solo some like, oh, that's mine. I thought that was Doug's.
Well, yeah, because you guys normally, you're working on effects.
Yeah, but we're all musicians. Everybody here is a musician.
Oh, that's fascinating.
And I got to say, in reference to what you were talking about earlier, human beings are wired as musical creatures. We respond to musical sounds. So if you're a sound effects designer or whatever, and you design from a musical point of view, you'll reach more people.
With tonality and emotion.
Period. You will reach more people.
So you were telling the story about Kay walking in the desert?
Oh, yeah. So there's this big queue that goes there, and they had written all this beautiful music that, went from him starting to walk from the car all the way to the bees and the whole section, right? It's a 3-minute queue or so. We played it, and Denis like, okay, let's start going through the list and saying, yeah, no, maybe not. No, take that out. I like that one, but no, let's not. We just kept eliminating everything. And I'm like, I'll back up a little bit. There was a moment halfway through our final or so where we were told by the legal department that we couldn't use any sounds from the original.
We didn't.
And we had had certain sounds that were like a nod to the original. That was really cool, right?
Yeah, you would want to have a little Easter egg, a little.
Yeah, some of them were the spinner sounds, elements of that, and there were all these big drum hits that. The big classic bang, like that.
You're thinking from like the opening
montage
of Blade Runner, right?
I had taken those from the first film, blown them out to 7/1, and that's what Ron started with.
Yeah, and then Mark calls me at 9:00 at night. He goes, "I just got a call. We have to get rid of all those sounds. You're a drummer and a percussionist. Can you play and record some tonight and bring them in?" And I said, "Sure thing." So I stayed up till like 3 a.m. playing all these drums and recording stuff in my home studio. and I mastered them all in 7/1, brought them in the next morning, and started putting them through the whole movie where they were, replacing everything, including the very first sound in the film, the opening title. Right. So back to the Vegas walk, those were huge drums in that, and we had deleted everything else. I was okay. I said, Denis, all I got left are the drum hits. He says, well, play it, see how it goes. We hit play and we sat back. It was like, boom, and then nothing. It's like this light wind and footsteps. It was so creepy. We all went, oh, wow. It was really cool.
It's way more eerie.
Yeah,
that's when mixing is the most fun, when you've got a bunch of people together and suddenly something like that happens, and everybody in the room knows that it's happened.
Yeah, well, I love that story because there, and we've all experienced this, that there's that magic moment of alchemy that can happen when you put just the right sound effect or the right music on a scene, and suddenly it's a movie. It's so
sparse but so effective.
It was such a quiet scene, and it was one of the things, wasn't it, is that we got to really highlight the dynamics by having such an enormous boom, and then it just tails down to a whisper.
It's by far the most dynamic movie I think any of us have worked on as far as that goes.
Well, I want to ask you guys about that, and I had the pleasure, probably a little over 2 years ago, to do a talk back at the LA Film Festival with Denis and Joe Walker. We screened Arrival and I had a conversation with the two of them about it in front of an audience. And kind of preparing for that, I went back and I watched all of Denis' films, and the thing that was really popped out at me immediately, especially when looking at a movie like Sicario, like this, I recognized immediately this is a director who knows how to use sound to tell story. So what was it like working with him? Did he challenge you guys in some areas that really pushed you? What
I loved about him is that he would just let you work.
Yeah.
He'd let you create something and put it all together, expecting that you would bring your A game to the
and that's the best feeling in the world, to have somebody who trusts you to that extent. Obviously, he's a great artist, and to have an artist like that who says, "I want to see what you bring to my project," that's a real honor. It's
and of course he would guide us and say, "Okay, let's go this way or that way," and he had his ideas as well, and we would always, try to find exactly what his vision was in the scene, or he would give us a few quotes that were awesome. Like at the seawall, he would say, I want this to be an operatic theme that goes through the entire thread as one piece. So you keep that in mind as we were mixing, to make that never pull your foot off the pedal.
But at the same time, just to give some perspective, this was not an overly talkative crew, right? This is a crew this is the show me crew. So we're always like, well, let's just do it and see what happens, and then we would respond. There wasn't a lot of
not a lot of sitting around talking about.
No, Denis, he's obviously
what you're doing.
He's obviously a very bright man, and he expects you to be the same. He's not going to explain something to you. It's more of like we're working intuitively. I don't know if that makes sense, but
no, it totally does. And one of the things that I wanted to talk with you guys about, because I've certainly been on a lot of final mixes. Usually by that point that the director has been living with his or her film for years at that point, and maybe it doesn't quite have the same impact as for them as when they first started with the project. And I have seen it happen many times that their gut reaction when they finally get to the final mix stage is just to turn it up. That's the only thing that's going to jolt them out of their chairs anymore. Wow. So, but the thing with Denis, I love the silent moments and the quiet moments, and you talked about the dynamic range in this film, and I would love to, there's so many great moments. There's the walk in the desert, but there's also the sound design in some of those moments. The quiet moments is so specific and so beautiful. When watching the film again, I was thinking about that first scene after the character, the holographic character Joy, kind of is liberated, and they go up to the roof, and the rain the rain hitting her. Is this really beautiful and very quiet, but really specific sound design.
That discussion I mentioned earlier that I had with Joe in the editing room was all about silence and how we would handle silence and what was my approach for silence. And that's if that's the first conversation you're having with your filmmakers, it's pretty exciting because it's clear that we'll get to the big moments. And in some ways, the big moments are the easiest to do. I mean, you ask a film editor, they'll all say action sequences are the easiest things to cut. So too, I think for sound and mixing and design and editing, the big sequences will handle themselves. But how do you sell silence without actually doing silence? You don't want to go to all zeros, in the digital soundtrack.
But that's confidence. Somebody who can deal with silence.
But it's reflected in his edit as well. His edit is very languid. He's very secure in letting a shot go on a lot longer than what's traditional in Hollywood filmmaking. He had that same confidence in his use of sound. And we exploited that to an incredible degree, I think, in our design as well as our mix philosophy.
That's a good point, because like most audience members or people that don't know much about sound, but they love movies, they'll see an action movie and go, wow, the sound on that was so much sound. It's not
What they're saying was it was a lot of sound.
It's a lot of it, but
Our award is for best sound, not most sound.
that's the key.
That's a great point.
Like all those details and that subtlety and all that, those are the hardest moments to do.
Because the rain, for example, we took a specific approach to the rain. When they're on the roof, for me, personally, it was Kay is finally going to have a romantic moment. Right. This guy deserves this moment. And it was very delicate. So we played the rain in a very delicate way because it was beautiful. And it was about...
But Doug, you did something even better than that, though. You started the rain very real and intuitively. And what's you think like an actor when you mix.
It was literally, I was going into Kay's head of what he was feeling
There's
at the time.
this beautiful shift.
And so it's very delicate and beautiful, and you think, this is it. It's romance. It's going to be a beautiful thing, and then he gets the call from work, and the real ring comes back. And I don't want anybody to notice that, but I do want them to feel it.
But what's your favorite? You quote it. I want to quote you because it's such a beautiful idea. How you mix, your philosophy of mixing. Well, you've said this to me 20 times. The way you think like an actor.
He's on the spot.
The way you read a film like an actor.
Well, I always am I travel through a movie, first of all, through the actors' voices. But the one thing I want to say to people out there in the audience is in terms of sound, in terms of what we do, the people you're listening to talk right now, think about what is the sound of your life, as an audience member. What do you get up? What do you listen to? What do you like to surround yourself with? And that's what we're doing for a director or whatnot. We're designing the soundtrack to Kay's life, to this story. So it's much the same. It's analogous with what audience members do in their lives. They're listening to music, they're enjoying sound. It's a very aesthetic thing. That's what we do in movies.
That's very much the same sort of guidance that I got from Denis when it came to the sound design. Should always be, we should be looking at what's going on inside Kay's head via his eyes. There are so many close-up shots of eyes and long, still someone processing something that they're seeing, but we're not seeing what they're seeing. Right. So the sound design was very often very internal. He described it as psychoacoustic, which I think is quite a good one.
Yeah, psychoacoustic. Yeah.
Yeah, which again is a lot of that's coming from the way that the actors are performing and the way that they've been shot by Roger Deakins, and a lot of those kind of cues that I was taking for the sound design were literally just, putting yourself inside someone's head and trying to register exactly the emotions that they're going through and designing the sounds around them to reflect that. Yeah.
It's a great collaboration between all of us and Clint Bennett, the music editor, Byron Wilson, the dialogue editor. That core group of us were on the stage every day, throwing ideas around.
Like
and
hive mentality.
Yeah, it was like this subtle thing of like, a lot of it was intuitive, where it was like, oh, you'd hear someone do something, ooh, that's cool, and we would adjust to that, and someone would do something else.
It was a good band.
You guys were all riffing off each other.
It was a good band.
Absolutely.
And Denis.
Well, that's good because we've all been on stages where it's a little bit of tug of war.
We didn't have a minute of that.
No,
and that it stems from Denis and his vision and how we.
Here's a good example. When Kay goes to Sapper's place, right? We got into this whole Sergio Leone thing with the boiling pot. Now we love that idea.
This is at the very beginning.
Yeah,
of the
at the very
film,
beginning.
right, yeah.
Sapper's got his garlic boiling on the pot, and it was that whole Sergio Leone thing where it's just sitting there going. Blah, 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 blah.
Yeah, just kind of providing a little tension.
So we did our first pass, and it was like we were in love with ourselves. This is the greatest thing. But we came back a couple.
I love
days
my
later.
own film references. Right? Yeah.
I don't know how somebody phrased it. I don't know who said it or whatever, but somebody said, I think maybe we can tone that down just a little bit. So we went to reality. We still executed the idea, but we weren't so much in love with ourselves with that.
Yeah, I want to get back to the previous statement because I think it's so important. One of the things that Doug and Ron did so beautifully on this film is crafting those dynamics. And I just want to say I'm really thrilled about the nomination that we've received from BAFTA and the Academy as well, because for Blade Runner, because I think it's a recognition of the subtlety in our use of quiet. I think so often our award is easily mistaken, as we joked earlier, as the award for the most sound. That non-sound people think that it's the loud movies that should have that get nominated because it's in a way it's just like, well, that's obvious sound. And this is a real acknowledgement that you can do, that there's a sophistication, at least in the sound community, that subtle, nuanced work is really valuable.
But let's be honest. But let's be honest, because the nominations come from the branch, so this is even within our own community.
But that's what I find thrilling.
Yeah,
I'm just acknowledging. It's a shout out to my peers. Thank you very much. I just think that loud movie. I think the abuse of loudness, which is where Ron and Doug were so sensitive in our film, is a cheap tool when a filmmaker is kind of bereft of ideas. And I don't think Denis was hypersensitive to that. Ron and Doug were hypersensitive to that. And I think we crafted one of the most dynamic tracks, as you guys have said.
Yeah. I mean, you'll
ever hear.
You guys weren't shy. There are some big moments in this film.
Yeah, and the key is big and not painful. When you're pushing people out of the theater with just abrasive, loud sounds, no one really wants to hear that. We went for bigger, more expansive, like epic sounds instead of the harsh, biting things.
I'd love to.
And an immersive thing as well.
Yeah, absolutely. You're not going to be listening to a Christmas CD of explosions, let me put it that way.
Yeah, exactly.
Although, Theo and we have a montage. Can we talk about the montage? Yeah. We don't have a Christmas CD, but Theo and I created an 8-minute montage of what we think the sort of greatest hits. That's a crass way to. I'm sorry. Say it for me. I've already ruined. We created an 8-minute montage of what we think are the sort of more compelling sound design moments in the film that we've just posted online at.
It's,
give a shout out to it.
Blade Runner 2049sound.com.
Blade Runner 2049sound.com.
If you want to hear the kinds of things that we're talking about, you can go to this link. It's a SoundCloud link, and you can hear the sound in its sort of pristine state.
Well, I would love to roll up our sleeves and talk about some sequences if we can. So I had the pleasure, the first time I saw the film was at a Dolby Cinema in Dolby Vision and Dolby Atmos, and it was quite a stunning experience. And then we watched it up in San Francisco together.
That was a stunning experience. It's as good as sound reproduction gets.
We've got a very nice screening room up at Dolby World headquarters in San Francisco, and I was really glad to, when we brought Mark up to do an evening with us and we ran the film, and we did a sound check beforehand, and Mark just said, "This is the way Denis would like for people to watch this movie," which was very satisfying. But the first time I saw the film, the sequence, they're in Vegas and Kay and Deckard are fighting in the showroom with the malfunctioning holograms. That was the scene that just completely took my breath away. Like it just was just so exciting from a sound perspective. So can you talk a little bit about that scene? Because I also understand that went through a little bit of an evolution.
Theo, that's all Theo. Well, and Ron and Doug, but I mean, it starts life in the design phase with some clever work that Theo and Joe did.
And Clint.
And Clint as well, thank you.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, it started off as a sequence scripted very differently, where Deckard was sort of using a cacophony of different music to lose Kay in that sort of in that arena. That is to say that when we entered that scene, the first thing we would have is Elvis singing, and then it wasn't glitching out. Originally, the idea was you'd have a whole performance running the whole way through the scene. But on top of that, sort of superimposed on top of Elvis, first Marilyn Monroe singing "Happy Birthday, Mr. President," Liberace playing the piano, a Bollywood dance troupe, a tiger, an elephant. I remember it just got insane. There was like this
just more
build up of insanity.
A cacophony, really.
And that's, in itself is a great idea. It just turned out that when we played the first cut of the film back with that in its original incarnation, first of all, it was visually and sonically confusing, which was sort of the idea. but visually we were losing where Deckard and Kay were in the room. It was just kind of cluttered. Yeah, so I mean, visually it was cluttered because of all of these elements that had been filmed in separate passes. So to some extent, Joe Walker was then able to look at what he was able to remove, and it was his idea. Maybe we have like a broken projector, and maybe Elvis is just sort of sporadically appearing around the room. Right. This left us with a problem of, what are we going to do with the sound? And, originally the idea was that we don't really hear anything. There's this cacophony of music going on. So as with many of these sort of scenes where we weren't quite sure where we were going and what we wanted to do with it, Joe passed me a very early version of the scene and just said, see what you can do with this and play with this. And so I came up with the idea of, taking the music of Elvis and glitching it out in various different ways so it sounded as if there was something horribly wrong with the projector, which was, it punctuated an otherwise very silent scene, which was doing something which made it tense and scary. And that was something that had been lost in that first incarnation. It was like a crazy musical number, and we'd lost the sense of there being a manhunt, and we'd lost the sense of Deckard being scared for his life, frankly. Right. So suddenly pitching them in the silence and being able to hear Kay's breath and Deckard's footsteps, and then suddenly you've got like a blast of Elvis glitching out in front of you. It restored that sense of, you don't know what's going on, you don't know what's going to happen next.
It's disorienting
it's
and
really
eerie
disorienting.
And
but
very
then
unsettling.
we're also in silence and dark, and so I kind of, we get the license to play with what might be there, what we're not seeing, and that was the idea, I think, that led to, well, we don't know what the mechanism is that's supposedly able to go around the room and project these holograms around the place. So
I love those little clips and relays and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, there's the idea of having, hidden malfunctioning machinery in the roof making bizarre sounds that, it's just disorientation and punctuating the silence. And then suddenly a gunshot kind of next to Kay's head. And so, yeah, we got to really reshape a scene whilst we were still in the very first cut of the film. And I think up until that point, Denis was considering that scene might have to get cut out of the movie because it just tonally was
my favorite
Now
scene in the film.
many people will say it's one of the best scenes in the movie.
Yeah.
But
it's
yeah,
so effective.
It's a kind of carte blanche to do something interesting with sound when you've got, something that's effectively a dark room with two scared people in it.
Except for that walk in the desert, it might be one of the most dynamic scenes in terms of quiet to loud in the entire film. And it caps, I think what's one of the things that's interesting about it, by the end of that scene, it caps about a 12-minute run of no dialogue and no music. It is sound design from the first boom in the walk in the desert till, you could argue the blast of music inside the... Yeah. And no dialogue.
We get there's just a few words exchanged between Kay and Deckard,
right.
and then then they're into this sort of manhunt.
That's brave filmmaking.
Yeah.
It is.
That's right.
It is, yeah. Talk to me a little bit. L.A. in 2049 is almost, it's a very important character in this film, just as L.A. in 2019 was in the first Blade Runner. But how did you guys approach what L.A. sounds like in 2049? What were the elements of that?
Well, I think there was this great idea that came from Denis, which is one of the establishing ideas. Really, there are different levels to the city. If you're down on the ground level, perhaps you're getting sort of cheaper accommodation, and it's
You live
just
in a hovel.
It's basically it's pretty dystopian. It's pretty. Wait, do you live on the ground level?
I live in downtown LA, so
Okay, so you're already there.
Luxury.
I'm in the noisy part.
We get introduced to that pretty early on in the film. You see Kay walking home from the police station after his first baseline test, and he's being bombarded with kind of, there are projected adverts on the sides of buildings. There's we have a few throwbacks to the original film where we're talking about the off-world colonies in the commercial that's overhead, and it's grim and it's really an unpleasant world. Denis' idea was that as we go sort of further up in Officer Kay's apartment block, things start to quieten down. We hear perhaps just a few different advertising things outside his apartment. But then when we go up to the very top of his building for that sequence in the rain with Joy, we start to hear, it's almost as if there's a sort of tranquilizing message being broadcast throughout the city. There was this wonderful recording that Byron and I did of a Korean speaker saying a sort of a prayer mantra and a sort of meditation speech in very slow, kind of tranquilized Korean. And that's one of the things that Doug and Ron blended beautifully into that sort of cityscape that we see as we sort of open out into that shot on the roof. So the idea being that almost the further you go up in the city, perhaps you're getting to you have a level of peace up further away from the crowds. And that's something I think that really helped define just topographically where we are in the city at any time.
Sure.
And yeah, it's kind of a hellhole down on ground level.
Mm-hmm.
Which is like BB's bar would be.
Yeah.
That was like the most intense area where there was, a total polyglot, so many different languages. You name it, it's in there. Russian and everything. So all the billboards were different languages, the holograms, and it was like planned chaos. We would go through that scene, and we would focus in on a certain one. It was an ad that was a big hologram, and you'd hear that predominantly, but you'd still hear other things around you. And as you'd spin and move, they would all move off, and another one would come up, and we just kept layering that and picking and choosing which ones fit properly, so that it was still dense, but it was just chaos.
All based on executing the themes that Denis was doing of what it means to be human. What's an authentic human being? That's all those things. The lower level, the upper level. It's all supporting that and developing it. So.
I hadn't thought about it in quite that way, but that's really interesting. And then I did want to ask you guys, but this sort of naturally leads into it. Sort of probably one of the highest levels in Los Angeles is Wallace's space, and that acoustically has a very distinct sound. Can you talk about how you guys constructed, and also how you handle dialogue in that space?
Ronald did some amazing work with dialogue there, and he and Max should take that. But all of Wallace's space consisted of, or is underpinned by, these designed kind of musical architecture in the spirit of the first Blade Runner, just to create this kind of Zen feeling of calm. And you had there was so many interesting visual elements for you guys to play off on as well, because there obviously water was very important. Yeah.
As in every scene, there's Roger Deakins' practical lighting effects.
We use those for inspiration for a lot of these musical, one of those kind of shimmering, whatever those reflections were that Roger created, was the first inspiration for me to go to bells and chimes to create the first layer of what would be these musical underpinnings to all of those scenes. And that, I thought, was the musical embodiment of what I was seeing visually. And that's what you hear in the large water room when we meet Neander Wallace and Love comes in, and the various other scenes when you're in that room. Then we go to the replicant birth room that has another layer of those processed musical chimes, as well as, because it was a birth room, it has the sounds of my firstborn in the womb. So there are these sort of prenatal sounds that kind of undergird that scene as well. But and Theo, I know in Love's Office, there's some beautiful things that you did that were those very musical kind of shimmering bits. I never knew what you made those from.
That's right. Well, they're sort of synthesized shimmers in
Don't tell him the answer.
That's secret.
Top secret.
But yeah, I think it was that idea of having a sort of a Zen space that in many ways is at odds with the evil character that Wallace obviously is. He's someone pointed out to me that the entire Wallace headquarters are lined with wood, and wood has become this incredibly precious thing in Blade Runner 2049. When Kay brings that little wooden horse to crumbs, forgotten the name of Dr. Badger. He says that he can get him a real horse with this. There's just the price of the wood. So the idea that Wallace's headquarters are kind of lined with this incredibly expensive wood material made me think of it's like a Japanese Zen bathhouse that he's living in. So we were trying to create these sort of Zen textures. Every now and then we went slightly off too far into what they call scented candle.
I had experimented with processed shakahachis, and Joe, I think, commented, "I feel like I'm in a bathhouse." Or something.
Yeah.
So we took those out.
Massage.
A massage parlor. That's right.
And then the way you handle dialogue in that space is very specific.
Yeah, we tried to come up with a very unique atmospheric element that keyed off of the dialogue to be able to put you in that environment. It's easy to just put a big reverb on it and call it good, and it was like, okay, that's great. But Mark and I actually developed a plugin early on that we really wanted to use in this film, and it was very much in the beta state, but we were working with him during the final, even trying to get it to work and be able to utilize it. And it allowed us to have it was a decorrelated return of 37 different channels of reverb that's all doing different things subtly, and we would place each one of those in an object. So you look at the Dolby ping pong ball,
The Atmos renderer, yeah.
It just goes lights up. There's all these balls around.
And that's all dialogue.
It's all from dialogue.
Wow.
37 channels of reverb return dedicated to 37 objects.
Yeah.
But Ron did a gorgeous job of filling that space and putting Neander's voice whenever we're in those Wallace rooms.
Yeah, I also used a delay and some other things that would ripple and tail off, in a unique way that didn't become distracting, but you felt like, wow, this guy's like the voice of God in there. Right. And I will point out, as a shout out to Mac, he gave us beautiful tracks with a boom mic that I don't always get. I'm always trying to go between lav and boom. He gave me such great tracks that it allows you to do that, because there's a clarity involved. If you have this ball of noise in the center and you put reverb and delay, it just is a mess. Yeah. So a big props to Mac for that, because that allowed us to really create that sense. When his voice hits and then there's nothing, shout out to Mac.
Well, that's a part of his sort of purist. Mac, come back with that. What that great quote was: your purist approach to always having a boom, which gives the reality of the space. You take it, Mac.
Yeah, it's you can fake good sound. Sound is the first sense that we experience in the womb, and it's the thing that's our most internalized. It's our safety sense. It is what it is. When you start to cheat it, is when it starts to throw everything out of whack and it raises questions. So again, it was just purely organic, and we really focused on the core value of the performance of the actor and getting it. And being able to do that, being part of a team that saw the value in that, was a great privilege.
A shout out to Mac and to Ron especially, because I think all too often with these kind of tentpole movies, the production sound and the sound of the dialogue is kind of the last priority. The big noisy movies, the explosions and the sound effects are great and the music is bombastic, and dialogue kind of gets left behind. But I think our film is uniquely spectacular in how beautiful and pristine and sonorous our dialogue is. I think that's really rare in these kinds of movies, and that's a testament to what Mac delivered to us as raw tracks, what Byron Wilson, our dialogue supervisor, created, and what Ron did in the mix. You never see that.
How much ADR is there in the film?
Very little.
Not that much.
Very little. Only stuff that we changed for expository reasons. It wouldn't have been for technical. I don't think we looped anything for technical reasons.
Really? So if it's looped, it was for performance, or
for a change of text, for a change of idea.
For change of, right? Yeah. Interesting.
That's astonishing.
It is.
Mac. That's astonishing.
We all bow. You're not worthy.
Well, that's fantastic. Well, you brought up Dolby Atmos, so I would it was, and you guys have all worked in Atmos before, and you've had a lot of time to play with the format. How was it specifically useful for this film, and for an audience who may be fortunate enough to have Dolby Atmos in a home theater? What would you have them listen for in the intro?
You know what I love about it the most is it's scenes that are more sparse really show off Atmos and these immersive formats. Everyone thinks it's the big, car chase,
Spaceship
gun battle,
behind.
whatever, big action scene. The more dense your track is, the less point source, you really realize what's going on. And it's not as clear. It's just everywhere and it's loud and you're like, okay, what happened? It's scenes like that Wallace scene or others like the baseline test. We had the interviewer guy that was, really oppressive on Kay. He's primarily in the overhead on the ceiling. I mean, he's everywhere with his, reverb and other things like that. But his direct signal is up on top of you to be very oppressive and claustrophobic was the whole idea. You can't do that with other formats.
The important thing to remember, too, here is that with Dolby Atmos, the cart is not in front of the horse, so to speak. And by that, I mean that if you're a minimalist, if you're an action director, whatever, you can bring whatever your idea is to Atmos, and it's going to serve that well. It's just a great sounding format. It's not a format that's saying you must do this, you must do that. You can do whatever you want. It's just a complete creative tool. It's wide open, and it sounds
I think, following up on what Ron said, our biggest successes are in the quiet scenes because they're so immersive. And I think there's this psychoacoustic reason why that's valuable. It allows you to create a sonic reality that helps the audience suspend disbelief. The more you can immerse an audience into a sound environment that feels real, without gimmick, the sooner they sign off on what they're seeing. So I think we did much more, especially Doug, in terms of the sound effects of creating environments that enveloped us by using objects and surrounds and overheads to just place you in a reality, never to be gimmicky or to deflect your attention from the front of the screen. I think that's where we were really, an area where we were really
when
successful.
Atmos first came out, because I remember when it first came out, people were getting really confused because they were intellectualizing too much about it. But as soon as you sit down and start using it, it just becomes, if you're an intuitive artist or whatever, it just is obvious. It just works. It's just a beautiful.
I think that one of the things that kind of surprised me, and I think surprised a lot of people here at Dolby, you develop these tools and then you unleash them on the world and you put them in the hands of artists. You really never know what's going to happen after that.
No, you don't.
But one of the things that, I remember it was actually Life of Pi was one of the first mixes that I heard people talk about this, and they said, it was Eugene Garrity I was talking with about it, and he said, we were pretty conservative about it on the sound design and sound effects side, but it was the music department that really immediately understood the possibilities.
The composer, very much so.
Michael Dana was all over that. We first experimented with it before he showed up, and I had done a pass on the whole film, experimenting, pushing things around, like, oh, this would be cool if we put the choir up behind us, and we put this, and we really spaced it out and did some really cool things with depth, that I was never able to do. And especially in like any action scenes, you could pull the music off the screen and allow more space for that to happen. And it allows this great depth of field, if you will.
Yeah, because you can pull the score just into the first set of speakers off the screen.
Absolutely.
Because obviously stereo image changes with dynamics and changes with sound density. So as you get more dynamic, more sound pressure level, your imagery narrows. So what Ron is saying essentially is you can really recreate a wide stereo image. And I got to tell you a funny thing. Ang Lee asked me once, we were showing him Atmos, and he said, Doug, why don't they put speakers in the floor? And I said, because, Ang, people spill their damn Cokes on the floor.
And you're like, oh, all right. But I'll tell you, when after we did that first pass, I was a little nervous because that's something really new and it was definitely bold for what you've ever heard before. And Michael Dana came in and sat down and just lit up. He's like, this is amazing. Can we do more of this? Can we put this back there? And I'm like, well, I did. I'll accentuate it more. And we just hit it off so well. It was like, yeah, let's do that. Let's do this. Let's move the chimes over here. It was all sorts of stuff. He loved it. So we even pushed it a little further with him. So I was pretty happy about that.
Ron did some amazing stuff with the music in the Atmos environment. I remember, it turns out that Dolby keeps track of how much data you use for objects. That's a known number. And
Of course we do.
And I was told by our Dolby rep that our film had used more data than any other film. Now, wait a minute, let me finish this. This is important because this is not my way of saying we're bigger and better than everybody else, because that's not where I'm going with this. What's important to recognize is that very little of that data was used in sound effects. It was, because he said this, he says, it's the amount of spread that, because Ron had all this amazing separation, in almost every music cue, Ron had every speaker with something special in it from the score. And that's what was enveloping the audience, and I think gave us this incredible sense of immersion without saying, oh, isn't it cool we put the explosion over there or the spinner passed by? Because Denis had actually said to us, I don't like sounds in the surrounds. And we had to be very cautious of that because he's very aware as a filmmaker that the movie's up in front of us.
He doesn't want to distract by
No, if
putting
you
a
have
bunch
to
of stuff.
stop and think, I mean, film's happening at 90 feet a minute. If you have to stop and think about why that sound was, you've taken the audience out of the film.
The last thing you want is, you hear a sound, you go, what? You're supposed to be paying attention to the film.
So what's the process for you? And you can talk about it with Denis, but when you have a director who hasn't worked in Atmos before, how do you kind of lead them into it?
It's again with Aang, he said he was very concerned about being given a mandate for what he must do as a creative person. And I said, no, it's simply a house. You decorate it any way you see fit. It's your home. Decorate it how you see fit. That's my approach.
Everyone on the team was aware of the sensibility about what our soundtrack should feel like. And, again, a testament to the sensitivity and the acumen of Ron and Doug. Denis came in for the first playback of Reel 1, as a director will do, and loved everything that he heard. So these guys had intuited very, very profoundly what our mission was and delivered an Atmos mix that was exactly what he wanted.
Denis' vision was so apparent to us in the story and visually and what was going on. We locked into that right away, and it really stems from him and what he put out there. We take that and then do what we do, but it's an important point that it really comes from him.
And just to give you a good example of how direct he is, right? He's a sweet, kind, dear, thoughtful person, but he does not compromise. We're at the seawall at the end, and it's a scene where Kay is saying, go see your daughter, to Deckard. And Denis said to me, Doug, this seawall sounds a little bit too much Blue Lagoon. I went, okay.
I don't know what that means.
No, I know what that means. I get it. So, and I laughed. I said, thanks, that I totally understand what you're going for. So we put more of the dystopian Blade Runner grit world back in that
Interesting.
scene. But that's the need. That one sentence, I knew exactly what
That's the direction you get from him. It's so profound and so short, it's amazing.
And specific.
Oh, very specific. And
But it always came from a story emotional standpoint. Yeah. Denis would never give us a granular note, lower the door close or raise the spaceship. He would always say, after playing a reel, this is what I felt.
Right.
Yes.
And from that, we could...
He was talking to you as an artist, to other artists.
Beautiful.
Yeah, every time. I mean, we'd always talk about a character or an emotional content or something that was a feel thing. It was always about that. Never about little details.
Although, again, a testament to Doug's deft mixing, in spite of his exhortation for us to not put things in the surrounds, he became quite proud of Doug's panning of the spinner. Right? He actually brags about it in an interview, which I never thought I'd hear.
Right? There's something in the surrounds.
Right.
One of the things I love so much about Denis, it's like we're at the end of the movie. We've been working very hard, and he's been working incredibly hard for a long time, and we're, Denis, what are you going to do? What are your plans? And he said, I want to go home. I want to go in the kitchen and dice some carrots. That's how he relaxed.
That's great. Well, any final thoughts? Anything that we didn't cover that you'd like to?
Yeah. One of the best compliments that I've gotten, that we have gotten, was said to me at the end of, I don't think I told you this, but after our little seminar after the Academy screening with Denis and Joe, a member of the audience came up to me and he said, I loved the sound of this movie. It feels like one soundtrack. And then he said, and I heard things I didn't see. And that phrase has really resonated to me, because I think that's kind of part of the success of what we achieved in sound in this film, is that we thought of it more as a painting, not a coloring book. Too often what we do is seen as the sound person puts in the sounds that are missing, just like you'd color in between the lines in a coloring book.
Or literally cover something that's visually represented
It's
in the picture.
diegetic, to
Right.
use an awfully academic term. What I think we all achieved was we colored way outside the lines. We were constantly using sound to create a universe. We built worlds for things that you didn't see, to be constantly informing the audience. I'm really proud of that.
And I think it was Joe Walker who said, if you close your eyes, you can hear the story.
Beautiful. Yeah, I didn't hear that. That's great.
That's great. Well, I do have one question I had for you guys, and it's going to be a tough race this year. This is 5 really amazing films that have been nominated. But I'm curious for you guys, I love all, amazing work in all the films, but what else was out there this year that really impressed you guys? Maybe that didn't
That wasn't nominated?
That didn't get a nomination.
This is going to sound whacked, but I thought All the Money in the World sounded fantastic. A movie you wouldn't expect to be something about sound, but the detail work in it was really beautiful.
Like Wind River, I thought it was a beautiful
Wind
piece of
River
work.
sounded great.
Wind River, huh?
And then there's another movie that's like very sparse. You wouldn't think of it as a sound movie, but you look at what they did.
And it was Alan Murray.
How it told that story. It was amazing.
Yeah.
I'm always impressed by the small movies. 3 Billboards, I thought, sounded fantastic in its simplicity, the right, simple choices, the right choices, deft mixing. And it all sounded like nice, fresh, original things, not library sound.
That's great.
It's a wonderful year. It's an amazing year.
I feel like we're kind of in a really interesting time for sound work. I think it's a really fertile time right now.
That's the one thing I did want to say out there to the folks is thank you to the people that love sound. Here. Thank you very much.
Absolutely.
For appreciating it.
Well, obviously, you 5 are nominated, but there were a lot of people working with you on these tracks. Who would you like to give a shout out to on your teams?
Definitely Byron Wilson and Clint Bennett, Del Spiva, and Ryan.
Yeah.
In music.
Tom
Ryan
Burns.
Rubin.
Thank you,
Ryan
Tom.
Rubin.
Our crew, Theo and I worked with some very gifted sound editors, Chris Odd, Lee Gilmore, Greg Ten Bosch, Elliot Connors, Charlie Campagna, who did a lot of field recording for us, Ezra Dweck, our Foley editor, and David Whitehead, who did some amount of the early design work with these musical textures for us as well.
Charlie did all kinds of stuff.
Yeah.
He came over to our house and we recorded Love Being Drowned in My Hot Tub. It wasn't her, it was another actress. So, we did all kinds of stuff, at home and, coming up with cool sounds. And Charlie was a big part of that.
He made some of those musicals, these amazing distorted guitar textures that were used for Kay's Nightmare or Charlie's.
Yeah. And I got to say, one of the more moving moments for us was at the end of the film. We screened it for Ms. Yorkin.
Oh, yeah.
And she was really moved by it. That meant a lot to all of us. That was a big deal.
This was Bud Yorkin's wife?
Yeah. She was very moved by the finished film.
She was so emotional when the lights came up and we looked over like, whoa, that was so heartfelt. I've never experienced something like that on a playback. It really affected her. She's talking about 30 years of trying to get this movie done and finished. She finally gets to see it and just loved everything about it. That was really worth it right there.
That's great. Mac, you have anybody you want to acknowledge?
Oh, absolutely. I have to, it all starts on the floor through my guys. My longtime boom operator of 15 years, George Mihai, my very best guys, Balazs Varga and Aaron Havashi. I couldn't do it without these guys. Absolutely fantastic work on the floor. And so thanks for that.
I need one more shout out. Ron and Doug and I are very lucky to be employed by a very progressive sound company known as Formosa Group in Hollywood. And without that kind of support, creatively and technically to keep us all functioning, we can't do what we do. So shout out to Bob and Matt from Formosa Group especially.
Great.
Thank you.
Well, we're going to wrap up here. We've been talking today with the team from Blade Runner 2049, nominated in both the sound editing and the sound mixing categories. So Mark Mangini, Theo Green, Ron Bartlett, Doug Hemphill, and Mac Ruth, thank you so much for coming in and talking with us today. It's been a pleasure.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
So much.
Thank you.
It's great.
Thank you very much.
This is Glenn Kaiser signing off from the Dolby Institute and the Soundworks Collection. Thanks for listening.